Picture this. It's 1550, and you're holding something that costs more than most people's houses. It's crystal clear, lighter than metal, and so perfect it seems to glow from within. Kings across Europe are fighting over pieces of it, and entire trade routes have been built just to get their hands on more. What is this magical substance? Glass, but not just any glass, cristallo from the tiny island of Murano, and the secret to making it is so closely guarded that revealing it could get you killed. Venice had a problem. By the late 1200s, the city was basically one giant fire hazard waiting to happen. Wooden buildings packed together like sardines, and right in the middle of it all, glass furnaces blazing at temperatures hot enough to melt copper. Every year, another devastating fire would tear through neighborhoods, and guess what was usually to blame? That's right, the glass workshops. Something had to give. The solution was brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. In 1291, the Venetian government basically told every glassmaker in the city, "Pack your bags, you're moving to Murano." This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, and just like that, an entire industry got relocated to a small island about a mile north of Venice. But this wasn't just about fire safety. The Venetians were about to turn glassmaking into the most tightly controlled luxury industry the world had ever seen. Think about it from the government's perspective. You've got craftsmen who can turn sand into something more valuable than silver. Do you really want them scattered across the city where foreign spies can watch their every move? Or do you want them all in one place, surrounded by water, where you can control who comes and goes? The choice was obvious. Murano became Europe's first industrial prison. Except the inmates were treated like royalty. The glassmasters didn't exactly hate their new situation. Sure, they were essentially under house arrest, but what a house arrest it was. The Venetian state showered them with privileges that would make modern CEOs jealous. We're talking about tax exemptions, legal immunity for minor crimes, and here's the kicker. Some of the most skilled masters were literally granted nobility. That's right, you could go from being a craftsman to having a noble title just by being really, really good at melting sand. But there was a catch. Actually, there were several catches, and they were all designed to keep Venice's glass secrets locked up tighter than a medieval treasure chest. First rule, you don't leave Murano without permission. Second rule, you definitely don't work for foreign competitors. Break either of these rules, and the penalties ranged from massive fines to something much more permanent. One famous case involved a glass master who tried to set up shop in France. Let's just say he didn't get to enjoy his French career for very long. The paranoia was real, and for good reason. European courts were literally sending industrial spies to try and steal glassmaking secrets. It was like the Renaissance version of corporate espionage, except instead of stealing computer codes, they were trying to figure out why Venetian glass was so impossibly clear and beautiful. The answer lay in something the Venetians called cristallo. Glass so pure and transparent, it made everything else look muddy by comparison. Creating cristallo wasn't just about having the right recipe, though that was crucial. It required materials so pure and techniques so precise that even tiny mistakes could ruin entire batches. The raw materials alone were a logistical nightmare. You couldn't just grab any sand from any beach. The Venetians used ultra-pure quartz pebbles that had to be ground to exactly the right consistency. Too coarse, and you'd get bubbles and imperfections. Too fine, and the batch wouldn't melt properly. Then came the soda ash, and this is where things got really interesting. The best soda ash came from a plant called barilla that grew along the Mediterranean coast. But not just any barilla would do. It had to come from specific regions where the soil conditions were perfect. Spanish barilla was the gold standard, so valuable that it was traded like a precious commodity. Pirates actually fought over shipments of this stuff because they knew how much the glassmakers would pay for it. The lime was equally important, providing stability to the glass mixture. But here's where Venetian chemistry got truly advanced. They discovered that adding manganese dioxide could remove the natural greenish tint that plagued most glass. It was like having a magical eraser that could make impurities disappear. The amounts had to be perfect, too little, and the glass stayed green, too much, and it turned purple. Getting it right required knowledge that took decades to master. Before any of these materials went into the furnace, they underwent a process called fritting. This was basically a preview of the main event. The raw materials were heated together at a lower temperature to burn off impurities and create a more uniform mixture. Think of it like making a rough draft before writing your masterpiece. The frit would be broken up, sorted, and any pieces with visible flaws would be tossed out. Only the perfect material made it to the final melting stage. The heart of every Murano workshop was the furnace that burned continuously, day and night for months at a time. These weren't just big ovens. They were engineering marvels designed to maintain precise temperatures around 1,400 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt copper. And maintaining that heat required an army of workers feeding the flames around the clock. The fuel consumption was staggering. A single furnace could burn through an entire forest worth of wood in a year. The furnace design itself was a closely guarded secret. The shape of the combustion chamber, the size and placement of the openings, even the type of clay used to line the walls. Every detail affected how the glass melted and how long the furnace would last. A well-built furnace could operate for 6 months straight before needing major repairs. A poorly designed one might crack within weeks, destroying months of work and thousands of ducats worth of materials. Inside the furnace sat the crucibles, massive clay pots that held the molten glass. These weren't ordinary pottery pieces. They were engineered to withstand extreme temperatures and thermal shock. The clay came from specific quarries, mixed with precise amounts of crushed pottery shards to prevent cracking. Each crucible took weeks to make and had to be carefully seasoned before use. A single crucible failure could contaminate an entire batch of glass, turning pristine cristallo into expensive garbage. The maestro was the undisputed king of this operation. He wasn't just a skilled craftsman. He was part artist, part scientist, and part conductor, orchestrating a symphony of fire and sand. Every morning, he'd inspect the glass in each crucible, checking its color, clarity, and working temperature. Too hot, and the glass would be thin and unworkable. Too cool, and it would be stiff and prone to cracking. The maestro had to read the glass like a musician reads sheet music, knowing exactly when it was ready for each step of the process. Working alongside the maestro was his carefully chosen team. The servente was his right-hand man, skilled enough to handle complex tasks, but not quite ready to run his own operation. Below him were the garzones, apprentices who'd spend years learning the basics before being trusted with anything important. This hierarchy wasn't just about skill levels, it was about trust. In a world where trade secrets could mean the difference between wealth and poverty, you only worked with people you trust with your life. The tools of the trade were deceptively simple, but required years to master. The blowpipe, a long iron tube used to gather molten glass, looked straightforward enough, but using it properly was an art form. Too much glass on the pipe, and the piece would be too heavy to control. Too little, and there wouldn't be enough material to work with. The maestro could judge the perfect gather size just by the feel of the pipe in his hands. Once the glass was gathered, it went to the marver, a smooth iron plate where the molten blob was rolled and shaped. This wasn't random rolling, it was a carefully orchestrated dance. The glass had to be kept at exactly the right temperature, turned at precisely the right speed, and shaped with just enough pressure to create a perfect sphere. One wrong move, and hours of preparation could be ruined in seconds. The magic really began when the maestro started inflating the glass bubble. Using controlled breaths through the blowpipe, he'd create a hollow sphere that seemed to grow from nothing. But this wasn't just about blowing air into molten glass. It required understanding how the material behaved at different temperatures, how quickly it would cool, and how to maintain perfect symmetry while the piece was constantly changing shape. Every few minutes, the piece had to go back into the glory hole, a smaller furnace opening used for reheating. The timing was critical. Wait too long, and the glass would become too stiff to work. Rush back too quickly, and the piece might collapse from thermal shock. The maestro developed an almost supernatural sense of timing, knowing exactly when each piece needed attention. The real artistry showed when it came time to transfer the piece from the blowpipe to the punty, a solid iron rod that would hold the piece while the top was opened and shaped. This transfer was like performing surgery while juggling. One slip, and a day's work would shatter on the workshop floor. The punty had to be attached at exactly the right angle, with just enough molten glass to create a secure connection without leaving visible marks. Opening the top of a piece required tools that looked like medieval torture devices, but demanded the delicate touch of a surgeon. The jacks, basically large tweezers, could grab and pull the hot glass into graceful curves. Shears could cut clean lines through material that was neither liquid nor solid. Wooden paddles could smooth surfaces that were still soft enough to deform, but hot enough to set your hand on fire. Creating the impossibly thin stems and delicate feet that made Murano goblets famous was where the real masters separated themselves from the merely skilled. These elements had to be perfectly proportioned, structurally sound, and beautiful, all while working with material that was cooling and hardening every second. The stems were often hollow, requiring the craftsman to maintain an air bubble through multiple heating and shaping cycles. One moment of inattention, and the bubble would collapse, leaving a solid, clunky stem that ruined the piece's elegant proportions. But cristallo was just the beginning of Murano's glass magic. The island's workshops produced decorative techniques that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Cane pulling was like watching someone stretch taffy, except the taffy was molten glass heated to temperatures that could melt your eyebrows off. The process started with gathering different coloured glasses onto a single blowpipe, creating what looked like a rainbow-coloured blob. But here's where it got wild. Two workers would grab opposite ends of this molten mass and literally run in opposite directions across the workshop floor. I'm talking about sprinting while holding glass that's over 1,000 degrees hot. One wrong step, and you'd have molten glass splattered across half the workshop. As they stretched this glass, something magical happened. The colours didn't mix. Instead, they formed incredibly thin, parallel stripes. A piece that started the size of your fist could be stretched into a cane 30 feet long and thin as your finger. These canes would then be cut into sections and used to decorate other pieces. It was like having glass spaghetti that you could slice and arrange into any pattern imaginable. The most famous technique using these canes was called lattimo, white filigree work that looked like someone had captured lace inside the glass. Creating lattimo required the patience of a saint and the reflexes of a cat. First, white glass canes would be arranged in a specific pattern inside a cylindrical mould. Then, clear cristallo would be blown into this mould, picking up the white canes and incorporating them into the walls of the vessel. The trick was getting the white canes to spiral perfectly around the piece without breaking or creating gaps. But lattimo was child's play compared to murrine work. Murrine were cross-sections of complex glass canes that created intricate patterns when viewed from the end. Imagine looking down the barrel of a kaleidoscope. That's what a murrine slice looked like. Creating the original cane required building up layers of different coloured glass in precise patterns, then heating and stretching the entire assembly while somehow maintaining the internal structure. The most complex murrine patterns could take weeks to plan and execute. Some contained over a dozen different colors, arranged in floral patterns, so detailed they looked like miniature paintings. Master craftsmen would sketch their designs on paper first, then translate them into glass by building up the pattern layer by layer. One famous pattern called millefiori, literally 1,000 flowers, contained hundreds of tiny flower motifs arranged in a single cane. Here's what made murrine work truly insane. Every step had to be perfect because there was no going back. If you messed up the color placement early in the process, you wouldn't know until you cut the finished cane weeks later. It was like baking a cake, where you couldn't taste it until it was completely done, except this cake cost more than most people's annual salary. Gold leaf inclusions were another Murano specialty that seemed to violate the laws of nature. How do you put paper-thin gold inside glass without it burning up or turning into brown smoke? The secret was timing and temperature control that would make a modern scientist jealous. The gold had to be applied at exactly the right moment when the glass was hot enough to accept it, but not so hot that it would vaporize the metal. The process looked like some kind of alchemical ritual. First, the gold leaf, thinner than human hair, would be carefully positioned on a glass surface. Then, another layer of molten glass would be applied on top, trapping the gold between two glass layers. The temperature had to be perfect throughout this process. Too hot, and the gold would disappear in a puff of metallic vapor. Too cool, and the glass layers wouldn't bond properly, leaving the gold exposed to air and oxidation. But the real showstopper was aventurine glass. Glass that literally sparkled from within, as if someone had captured starlight inside it. This wasn't achieved through adding glitter or external sparkles. Instead, tiny copper crystals were formed inside the glass itself through a process so complex and temperamental that only a handful of masters could pull it off consistently. Creating aventurine required adding copper and other metals to the glass mixture, then controlling the cooling process with almost supernatural precision. The glass had to be held at specific temperatures for exact amounts of time to allow the copper crystals to form and grow to just the right size. Too small, and they wouldn't sparkle. Too large, and they'd make the glass cloudy. The entire process could take days, and 1 degree of temperature variation could ruin the whole batch. The formula for aventurine was so closely guarded that it was literally written in code. Masters would create false recipes to throw off potential spies, hiding the real proportions in seemingly innocent workshop notes. Some families passed down the true aventurine recipe through oral tradition only, refusing to write it down anywhere. Even today, recreating authentic 16th century aventurine glass is considered one of the most challenging feats in glassmaking. Color control in general was like being a wizard who specialized in chemistry. Every shade had to be achieved through precise combinations of metal oxides, and these combinations changed depending on whether the furnace was running with an oxidizing or reducing flame. Copper oxide could produce red, green, or blue glass depending on the flame conditions. Iron could create anything from pale yellow to deep black. Cobalt gave brilliant blues, but add too much and you'd end up with glass so dark it looked like obsidian. The real nightmare was avoiding defects that would turn pristine cristallo into expensive garbage. Chords were streaky lines that appeared when different temperatures of glass mixed improperly. Stones were tiny crystalline inclusions that could cause the entire piece to shatter weeks after it was made. Striae were stress lines that made the glass look like it had been stretched too thin. Any of these defects could ruin a piece that had taken days to create. Quality control was ruthless. Every piece underwent multiple inspections before it was allowed to leave the workshop. Masters would hold finished pieces up to candles, looking for any hint of imperfection. They'd tap goblets with metal tools, listening for the clear ring that indicated perfect glass, versus the dull thunk that meant hidden stress fractures. Pieces that didn't meet standards were smashed on the spot. Better to destroy them than risk damaging the workshop's reputation. The final step in the process was annealing, slowly cooling the finished pieces in a special oven called a leer. This wasn't just letting them cool down naturally. Glass that cooled too quickly would be riddled with internal stresses that could cause it to explode without warning weeks or months later. The annealing process required following precise temperature curves that had been developed through centuries of trial and error. The layer was essentially a long tunnel oven where pieces were gradually moved from the hot end to the cool end over the course of several days. Temperature control had to be perfect. Too fast, and the glass would crack. Too slow, and the workshop would be backed up for weeks. Some of the most complex pieces required annealing cycles that lasted over a week, with temperatures dropping just a few degrees per hour. But even with all this incredible artistry and technical skill, Murano's glassmakers had one more trick up their sleeves that would revolutionize how people saw themselves, literally. Mirror making was where Murano glassmakers went from impressive to absolutely mind-blowing. Before the Venetians perfected their technique, mirrors were basically polished metal that gave you a reflection about as clear as looking into a muddy puddle. But Murano mirrors? They were like windows into another dimension, so perfectly reflective that people literally thought they were looking at magic. The process started with creating glass plates, which sounds simple until you realize that making a flat piece of glass without modern machinery is like trying to iron a shirt while riding a horse. The early method involved casting molten glass onto a flat surface, then rolling it smooth while it was still hot enough to melt your shoes. Getting an even thickness across the entire plate required the coordination of an entire team working in perfect synchronization. But here's where things got really wild: the silvering process. This wasn't just painting the back of the glass with some metallic coating. Venetian mirror makers used a technique involving mercury and tin that was so dangerous it probably shortened their lifespans by decades. Mercury vapor is toxic enough to make you hallucinate, lose your teeth, and develop tremors that would make holding a wine glass impossible. Yet these craftsmen worked with it daily, creating the most sought-after luxury items in Europe. The mercury tin amalgam had to be applied in a perfectly clean environment, which in the 1500s meant basically performing chemistry in a room where even dust particles were enemies. One speck of dirt, one fingerprint, one tiny imperfection, and the entire mirror would have dark spots or cloudy areas that made it worthless. The glass plate would be laid face down on the amalgam. Then pressure would be applied to force out air bubbles and create perfect contact between the reflective coating and the glass. The really insane part was that this process had to be done quickly, before the mercury started to separate from the tin. Workers had maybe 30 minutes from start to finish, working with materials that could kill them if they breathed wrong. It was like performing surgery while handling poison in a race against time. One workshop log from 1563 mentions losing 3 mirror makers in a single year to what they called the silver sickness, almost certainly mercury poisoning. Only the most trusted masters were allowed to learn the mercury tin silvering process. The knowledge was so valuable and dangerous that it was often passed down to just one apprentice per master, creating bloodlines of mirror makers who guarded their secrets more jealously than royal treasuries. Some families maintained monopolies on specific aspects of the process for generations, becoming wealthy enough to build palaces that rivaled those of merchant princes. The finished mirrors were so valuable that they were often worth more than their weight in silver. A large mirror could cost as much as a ship, and European nobility would literally go into debt to own one. The Palace of Versailles eventually contained over 350 Murano mirrors, representing an investment that could have funded a small war. When the French tried to break Venice's monopoly by luring away mirror makers, it triggered diplomatic incidents that nearly led to actual wars. But creating these masterpieces was only half the battle. Getting them to customers across Europe without destroying them required logistics that would challenge modern shipping companies. Every piece had to be wrapped in layers of straw, packed in custom wooden crates, and transported by boat through canal systems that weren't exactly known for their gentle handling of cargo. The packing process was an art form itself. Straw wasn't just stuffed randomly around the pieces. It was arranged in specific patterns that would cushion the glass while allowing for some movement during transport. Too tight, and vibrations would crack the pieces. Too loose, and they'd bounce around like dice in a cup. Experienced packers could tell, just by shaking a crate, whether the contents would survive the journey. From Murano, the crates would travel by boat through Venice's canal system to the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the German trading house that served as headquarters for Northern European commerce. This wasn't just a warehouse. It was a fortress designed to protect Venice's most valuable exports. Armed guards watched over the loading and unloading, and every crate was inventoried multiple times to prevent theft. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi was like Amazon's distribution center, except everything being shipped was worth a fortune and could shatter if you looked at it wrong. German, Flemish, and French merchants would place orders months in advance, sometimes putting down deposits that represented their entire annual profits. The building buzzed with activity as traders negotiated prices, arranged shipping routes, and tried to get their hands on the latest Murano innovations. From Venice, the glass would travel overland or by river to courts across Europe. French nobles competed to see who could own the most elaborate Murano pieces. German princes commissioned custom goblets decorated with their family crests. Even Ottoman sultans in Constantinople developed a taste for Venetian cristallo, creating trade routes that stretched from the workshops of Murano to the palaces of Istanbul. The branding was everything. Murano glass became synonymous with the highest quality luxury goods available anywhere in the world. Imitations popped up from London to Prague, but none could match the clarity, artistry, or technical perfection of the originals. Venetian merchants were so protective of their brand that they'd send agents to investigate suspected counterfeits, sometimes taking legal action against foreign workshops that tried to pass off their products as genuine Murano glass. Export records from the late 1500s show just how massive this industry had become. Single shipments could contain hundreds of pieces worth more than most people would earn in their entire lifetimes. One manifest from 1589 lists a shipment to the French court containing 47 goblets, 23 plates, 12 mirrors, and an elaborate chandelier. Total value equivalent to about $50,000 modern dollars. But the most impressive thing about this entire operation wasn't the artistry, the chemistry, or even the incredible wealth it generated. It was how Venice managed to keep the whole system running for centuries through a combination of state control, guild organization, and social engineering that was centuries ahead of its time. The guild system wasn't just about organizing workers. It was a complete social structure that controlled every aspect of a glassmaker's life. From the moment an apprentice started learning the trade, he was bound by oaths that made breaking guild rules more serious than breaking actual laws. These weren't casual promises. They were life-binding commitments enforced by both legal penalties and social pressure that could destroy entire families. Guild membership came with incredible privileges, but also crushing responsibilities. Masters received guaranteed markets for their products, legal protection from competition, and social status that could elevate them above their birth circumstances. But in exchange, they surrendered their freedom to work where they wanted, sell to whom they chose, or even travel without permission. It was golden handcuffs taken to an extreme that would make modern labor organizers speechless. The penalties for violating guild rules weren't just fines or temporary suspensions. Masters who tried to work outside the system could face exile, imprisonment, or worse. Their families could be blacklisted from the trade, their workshops could be seized, and their names could be struck from guild records as if they'd never existed. Some violations carried penalties that extended to the offender's children and grandchildren, creating multi-generational consequences for a single act of betrayal. But the most effective control mechanism wasn't punishment, it was the incredible benefits of staying loyal. Successful masters lived like nobility, with servants, fine houses, and social privileges that were impossible to achieve in any other trade. Some were granted actual noble titles by the Venetian state, elevating their families permanently above their artisan origins. The contrast between life inside the system and life outside, it was so dramatic that few masters ever seriously considered leaving. The state oversight went far beyond simple regulation. It was comprehensive control of an entire industry, disguised as protection and privilege. Venice didn't just tax the glass trade. It shaped every aspect of how it operated. Raw material imports were controlled to ensure quality and prevent shortages. Export licenses were required for all foreign sales. Even the number of workshops on Murano was regulated to prevent overproduction and maintain artificially high prices. Government inspectors regularly visited workshops, checking not just the quality of products, but also ensuring that no unauthorized techniques were being developed or shared. Innovation was encouraged, but only within approved channels that kept new discoveries under state control. Masters who developed significant improvements could be rewarded with exclusive licenses and royal patents, but they could also be required to share their knowledge with approved competitors to prevent any single workshop from gaining too much advantage. The paranoia about foreign espionage was completely justified. European courts regularly sent spies disguised as merchants, diplomats, or even religious pilgrims to try and steal glassmaking secrets. Some attempts were laughably obvious, like the French ambassador who spent suspiciously long periods watching workshop demonstrations. Others were more sophisticated, involving long-term infiltration attempts that could take years to discover. Counter-espionage became a serious business. Venice employed its own network of informants to identify foreign agents and protect trade secrets. Workshop layouts were deliberately confusing to prevent casual observation from revealing important processes. Key steps in the most valuable techniques were often performed in separate locations or at different times to prevent anyone from seeing the complete process. The most sensitive information was compartmentalized so thoroughly that some techniques could only be completed by teams where no single member understood the entire process. It was like a Renaissance version of nuclear weapons security, except instead of protecting atomic secrets, they were protecting the knowledge of how to turn sand into luxury goods that could buy kingdoms. This entire system, the artistry, the chemistry, the secrecy, the state control, created something that had never existed before, a pre-industrial luxury manufacturing operation that operated at the scale and sophistication of a modern multinational corporation. The combination of technical innovation, marketing genius, and political protection turned a simple craft into an economic engine that shaped European culture and taste for centuries. The legacy went far beyond just making beautiful objects. Murano's glassmakers essentially invented the concept of luxury branding, quality control, industrial espionage, and state-sponsored innovation. They proved that controlling both the means of production and the flow of information could create market dominance that lasted for generations. Modern tech companies, with their patent portfolios and trade secrets, are basically following a playbook that Venetian glassmakers wrote 500 years ago. When you hold a piece of authentic Murano glass from 1550, you're not just holding a beautiful object, you're holding the culmination of the world's first industrial revolution. This wasn't just about making pretty things, it was about creating a system so sophisticated that it wouldn't look out of place in a modern Silicon Valley boardroom. Except instead of protecting software algorithms, they were guarding the secrets of turning ordinary sand into objects that could buy castles. The genius wasn't in any single innovation. It was in how every piece fit together like a perfectly designed machine. The state provided protection and exclusive markets. The guilds controlled labor and maintained quality standards. The workshops pushed technical boundaries while keeping innovations secret. The merchants created global distribution networks that reached from London to Constantinople. Remove any one piece, and the whole system would have collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. What made this system truly revolutionary was how it turned craftsmanship into capital. Before Murano, Skilled artisans were basically fancy servants who made nice things for wealthy patrons. But Venetian glassmakers became something entirely new. They became industrial entrepreneurs who controlled entire supply chains, influenced international politics, and accumulated wealth that rivaled merchant princes. They proved that knowledge could be more valuable than gold mines or spice routes. The impact rippled far beyond just the glass trade. Other luxury industries started copying the Murano model: controlled production, protected secrets, branded excellence, and state backing. Silk weavers in Lyon, clockmakers in Geneva, and weaponsmiths in Milan all began organizing themselves along similar lines. Venice had essentially created the template for how to dominate a high-value market through a combination of technical excellence and political maneuvering. But perhaps the most impressive achievement was cultural. Murano glass didn't just serve existing demand, it created entirely new concepts of luxury and refinement. Before cristallo, people drank from metal cups or rough pottery. The idea that a drinking vessel could be a work of art, transparent as water but more valuable than jewels, was something completely new. Murano glassmakers didn't just make products. They made desires that people didn't even know they had. The workshops of Murano turned sand into more than just glass. They turned it into social status, diplomatic gifts, and symbols of power that shaped how European nobility saw themselves and their world. Kings might conquer territories with armies, but Venetian glassmakers conquered hearts and minds with beauty that seemed to capture light itself. In a world where most manufactured goods were crude and utilitarian, they created objects so perfect they seemed touched by magic. That tiny island, barely a square mile of workshops and furnaces, became the beating heart of a luxury empire that stretched across continents. From the moment raw materials arrived at the docks to the instant finished pieces left for royal courts, every step was orchestrated with precision that would make modern supply chain managers weep with envy. It was capitalism before capitalism had a name, quality control before anyone understood statistics, and global marketing before there were business schools to teach it. The secrets of Murano glass eventually spread, as all secrets do. Other regions learned to make cristallo, mirrors lost their mystique, and Venice's monopoly crumbled under the weight of changing times and new technologies. But for nearly 3 centuries, those furnaces on a small Venetian island proved something remarkable: that the right combination of skill, secrecy, and state support could turn the most basic materials into treasures that defined an entire age. Fire and sand, chemistry and artistry, tradition and innovation, all melted together into something that still takes your breath away 500 years later.